Stepdad kicked me out after Mom's death. Her secret partnership made him lose everything. I was sleeping in my car for the third week when I found the documents that would change everything. My name is Chris Martinez, and I was 26 years old, homeless, and completely alone after my mother's death. What my stepfather Frank didn't know when he threw me out and claimed everything as his own was that my mother had been keeping secrets, big ones. By the time I was done, Frank would be the one sleeping in his car. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about justice finally catching up with a man who thought he could erase a family. My mother, Eleanor, married Frank Garrison when I was 12. She was a single mom, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and Frank seemed like a blessing. He was successful, charming, and told her he wanted to take care of both of us. For the first few years, he actually did. Frank owned a construction company called Garrison Builders, specializing in commercial real estate development. He had the contracts, the connections, and the ambition to build something bigger. What he didn't have was the financial expertise or the business acumen to manage rapid growth. That's where my mother came in. Eleanor had a degree in accounting and 15 years of experience managing finances for small businesses. She was smart, detail-oriented, and had an intuitive understanding of cash flow and investment strategy. When Frank's business started expanding, she quietly became his financial advisor. "Just helping out," she'd tell me when I'd find her working late at the kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and contracts. "Frank's good at building things, but numbers make his head spin." What I didn't realize at the time was that she wasn't just helping, she was saving his business from bankruptcy. For 14 years, Eleanor managed every aspect of Garrison Builders' finances. She negotiated contracts, managed payroll, secured loans, and turned Frank's construction skills into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She worked from home, staying out of the spotlight, letting Frank take all the credit. "Your mother's the brains behind everything," Frank would joke at family gatherings. "I just swing the hammer." But as I got older, I started noticing things. The way Frank's tone changed when he talked about my mother's contributions, how he'd interrupt her when she offered business advice in front of others, the increasing frequency of arguments about money and decision-making. "She thinks she runs the company," I overheard him tell his business partner Dale Morrison one evening. "Needs to remember who actually built this thing." My mother never responded to these comments directly. She'd just smile and continue working, managing the business that Frank claimed as his own. The cracks in their marriage became more visible during my college years. Frank started making unilateral decisions about the business, often ignoring my mother's financial advice. He'd take on projects that were too risky, extend credit to unreliable clients, and spend money on equipment they couldn't afford. "Frank's getting reckless," my mother confided in me during one of my visits home. "He's forgotten that construction is a business, not a hobby." "Why don't you talk to him about it?" She sighed. "I've tried. He says I don't understand the construction industry. Says I should stick to bookkeeping and let him handle the big picture." But my mother wasn't just doing bookkeeping. She was running the entire financial operation of a company that employed 30 people and generated over $5 million in annual revenue. The final blow to their marriage came when Frank decided to bid on a massive municipal project without consulting her. The bid required a significant upfront investment and carried enormous financial risk. My mother had run the numbers and knew they couldn't afford it. "If we lose that contract, we lose everything," she told him. "You don't know what you're talking about," Frank replied. "This is construction, not accounting." They lost the contract, and because of the upfront costs and the resources they diverted from other projects, they nearly lost the business. That's when my mother made a decision that would change everything. though I wouldn't learn about it until much later. 2 years ago, Eleanor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors caught it late, and the prognosis was grim. 6 months, maybe a year if the treatment worked. Frank's response was to throw himself into work, leaving me to handle most of my mother's care. He'd visit the hospital occasionally, but he was always distracted, always taking calls about projects and contracts. "He's scared," my mother explained when I expressed frustration about Frank's absence. "Some people run toward problems, others run away. Frank's a runner." During those final months, my mother spent a lot of time organizing her affairs. She'd sit in her hospital bed with a laptop, making calls, reviewing documents, having quiet conversations with lawyers and accountants. "Just making sure everything's in order," she'd tell me when I asked what she was working on. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in March. Frank was at a job site and I was holding her hand. Her last words were, "Check the safe deposit box. Box 247 at First National. The key is in my jewelry box." I was too grief-stricken to think about what that meant. The funeral was small. Frank hired a budget service and invited only immediate family. He seemed eager to get it over with, to move on with his life. During the service, he talked about my mother as if she'd been a traditional housewife, mentioning her support and encouragement, but never acknowledging her role in building his business. 3 days after the funeral, Frank called me into his study. "Chris, we need to talk about your living situation." I was confused. I'd been living at home since college, helping care for my mother and saving money for graduate school. "What about it?" "This house is too big for just me. I'm thinking about downsizing, maybe getting a condo downtown, closer to work." "Okay, when are you thinking about moving?" Frank looked uncomfortable. "Actually, I was thinking you might want to start looking for your own place. You're 26. You should be independent." The words hit like a physical blow. 3 days after burying my mother, he was kicking me out. "This is my home," I said quietly. "It's my house," Frank corrected. "Your mother and I were married, so everything transfers to me. That's how marriage works." I stared at him, seeing a stranger. This man who'd been my stepfather for 14 years, who'd claimed to love my mother, who'd promised to take care of both of us. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to become an adult, find your own place, build your own life. I'll give you a month to get settled." "A month? That's generous. Legally, I could ask you to leave today." I packed my belongings that night. 14 years of memories, photos, personal items. Everything fit into my car. As I loaded the last box, Frank appeared in the doorway. "This isn't personal, Chris. It's just time for both of us to move on." I looked at him, standing in the doorway of the house my mother had made into a home. "She loved you, you know." "I loved her too, but she's gone and we both need to face reality." Reality, for me, was sleeping in my car behind a 24-hour diner, showering at the local gym, and trying to process the fact that the man I'd called Dad for half my life had discarded me like unwanted furniture. I spent the first week in a fog of grief and shock. I had some savings, enough for a deposit on an apartment, but I was paralyzed by the enormity of what had happened. My mother was dead, my home was gone, and my family had been reduced to zero. The second week, I started looking for apartments, but every place I looked reminded me of what I'd lost. The life I'd planned, graduate school, building a career, maybe starting a family, seemed impossible now. The third week, I decided to collect the last of my mother's belongings. Frank had packed everything into boxes and left them in the garage. "Just personal stuff," he'd said. "Nothing valuable." I was loading the boxes into my car when I found my mother's jewelry box. It was a simple wooden box she'd kept on her dresser, filled with inexpensive jewelry and sentimental items. I opened it, looking for anything that might remind me of her. and that's when I found the key. Small, silver, with 247 engraved on the side. The safe deposit box key she'd mentioned in her final words. First National Bank was across town. I drove there immediately, my hands shaking as I presented the key and my mother's death certificate to the clerk. Box 247, she confirmed. You're listed as the authorized accessory. The safe deposit box was larger than I'd expected. Inside were documents, files, and folders organized with the same meticulous care my mother had brought to everything else in her life. The first folder contained copies of business contracts, financial statements, and tax records for Garrison Builders. But as I read through them, I realized these weren't just copies, they were originals, bearing my mother's signature as a co-signer and business partner. The second folder contained correspondence with lawyers, accountants, and business advisors. Letters discussing E. Martinez's 50% partnership interest in Garrison Builders, and profit-sharing agreements, and ownership structures. The third folder contained a will, dated 6 months before my mother's death, leaving her 50% ownership stake in Garrison Builders LLC to her son, Christopher Martinez. I sat in the bank's privacy booth, staring at documents that revealed a completely different version of my mother's life. She hadn't been Frank's helpful wife, assisting with bookkeeping. She'd been his business partner, owning half of everything he'd built. The final folder contained a letter addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. Chris, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've hopefully found these documents. I need you to know the truth about Garrison Builders. When Frank and I got married, his business was failing. I didn't just help him recover, I invested my own money, my own time, and my own expertise to build what became our company. Legally, I own 50% of everything. The business, the contracts, the assets, even the house. Frank has never acknowledged this publicly because he's proud and stubborn, but it's all documented here. I've kept quiet about it because I loved him and wanted him to feel like the success was his. But I won't let him erase my contributions after I'm gone. This partnership belongs to you now. Use it wisely. Love, Mom. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. My mother hadn't just been supporting Frank's business. She'd been his silent partner, owning half of everything he claimed as his own, including the house he'd thrown me out of. I made copies of everything and put the originals back in the safe deposit box. Then I drove to the office of Patricia Hernandez, the lawyer whose name appeared on several of the documents. Ms. Hernandez, I need to discuss my mother's business partnership with Frank Garrison. Patricia was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She reviewed the documents I'd brought, nodding as she read. Your mother was very thorough, she said finally. This partnership agreement is ironclad. She owned 50% of Garrison Builders, and according to her will, that ownership transfers to you. But Frank never acknowledged the partnership. He's been running the business like he owns it completely. That's a problem. As a 50% owner, you have rights to financial information, decision-making authority, and profit distributions. If Frank has been operating without your consent, he's in violation of the partnership agreement. What does that mean? It means you have grounds to demand an accounting of all business activities since your mother's death. You can require his consent for major decisions. You can demand access to all financial records. And if he's been taking profits that should have been shared with you, you can demand repayment. I thought about Frank, sitting in his study, telling me I needed to become an adult and face reality. What's the first step? Patricia smiled. We inform Mr. Garrison that he has a new business partner. The next morning, I drove to the Garrison Builders office. It was a modest building in the industrial district, housing the administrative offices and equipment storage for the company my mother had helped build. Frank's business partner, Dale Morrison, was in the front office, reviewing blueprints with two foremen. Dale was a decent guy, a general contractor who'd been working with Frank for over a decade. He'd always treated me kindly, and I'd always suspected he knew more about my mother's role in the business than he let on. "Chris," he said when he saw me, "I'm sorry about your mom. She was a special lady." "Thanks, Dale. Can I talk to you privately?" We went into the conference room, and I showed him the partnership documents. Dale read through them carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Jesus," he said finally. "Eleanor owned half the company?" "According to these documents, yes, and now that ownership transfers to me." Dale sat back in his chair. "Frank never said anything about a partnership. He's been running this place like it's his sole proprietorship." "That's the problem. As a 50% owner, I should have been informed about all business decisions. I should have access to financial records. I should be receiving profit distributions." "What are you planning to do?" I thought about sleeping in my car, about being thrown out of my own home, about Frank's dismissive attitude toward my mother's contributions. "I'm planning to exercise my rights as a partner." Dale nodded slowly. "Frank's not going to like this." Frank's had 2 years to acknowledge my mother's partnership. He chose to pretend it didn't exist. That afternoon, Patricia sent a formal letter to Frank, informing him that Christopher Martinez was now the 50% owner of Garrison Builders and requesting a meeting to discuss the partnership moving forward. Frank's response came within hours. He called me, his voice tight with anger. "What the hell is this about, Chris? Some kind of scam?" "It's about my mother's partnership in your business, the partnership you've been hiding for years." "Your mother was my wife. She helped with bookkeeping. That doesn't make her a partner." "The legal documents say otherwise. Those documents are fake. Your mother never owned anything." "Then you won't mind if we have an independent audit of the company's finances, just to clear things up." The line went quiet. Frank knew that an audit would reveal not just the partnership, but also the extent of my mother's contributions to the business. "We need to meet," he said finally. "I agree. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at the office. Just you and me." "Me, you, Dale, and my lawyer." Another pause. "This is ridiculous, Chris. I'm not going to be threatened by some kid who's upset about his living situation." "I'm not threatening you, Frank. I'm informing you. I own 50% of this company, and I intend to exercise my rights as a partner." The meeting the next morning was tense. Frank arrived with his own lawyer, a nervous-looking man who clearly hadn't had time to fully review the situation. Patricia had prepared a comprehensive presentation outlining my mother's partnership, the legal documentation, and my rights as the new owner. "This is preposterous," Frank said, after reviewing the documents. "Eleanor was my wife. She helped with some paperwork. That doesn't constitute a business partnership." "Mr. Garrison," Patricia replied calmly, "your wife invested her own money in this company. She managed all financial operations. She negotiated contracts and secured loans. She's listed as a partner on every major business filing for the past 12 years. This isn't about helping with paperwork. This is about co-owning a business." Frank's lawyer whispered something in his ear, and Frank's face went pale. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want recognition of my partnership. I want access to all financial records. I want to be involved in major business decisions. And I want the profit distributions that should have been shared with my mother over the past 2 years." "That's impossible. The business can't support 2 owners." "It's been supporting 2 owners for 12 years. You just pretended one of them didn't exist." Dale had been quiet during the meeting, but now he spoke up. "Frank, Eleanor basically ran the business side of things. We all knew that." Frank turned to Dale with a betrayed expression. "You're supposed to be my partner. I am your partner in construction projects, but Elena was your partner in running the company. There's a difference." The negotiation took 3 hours. Frank fought every point, challenging the validity of the documents, questioning my mother's contributions, and threatening to dissolve the company rather than acknowledge the partnership. But Patricia was thorough, and the documentation was overwhelming. By the end of the meeting, Frank's lawyer was advising him to accept the partnership rather than face a lawsuit he couldn't win. "Fine," Frank said finally. "You want to be a partner? You can be a partner, but don't expect me to make this easy for you." "I don't expect easy," I replied. "I expect fair." The first order of business was a complete financial audit. What we discovered was eye-opening. For the past 2 years, Frank had been taking substantial profits that should have been shared with my mother's estate. He'd also made several major business decisions, including taking on a risky commercial project and purchasing expensive equipment, without the consent that would have been required from a partner. The audit revealed that Frank owed the estate over $300,000 in profit distributions, plus interest. "I don't have that kind of cash," Frank protested when presented with the findings. "Then we'll need to discuss a payment plan," Patricia replied, "or we can consider liquidating assets to satisfy the debt." Frank's face went white. "You can't liquidate company assets." "As a 50% owner, Chris has the right to demand his share of the company's value. If that means selling equipment or property, that's a viable option." That's when Frank made his biggest mistake. Instead of negotiating in good faith, he decided to fight dirty. Over the next week, Frank started undermining my authority as a partner. He'd schedule meetings without informing me, make decisions without consultation, and tell employees that I was just the old owner's kid and didn't have real authority. He also started spreading rumors about my mother, claiming she'd been confused about her role in the business and that the partnership documents were wishful thinking rather than legal agreements. The breaking point came when Frank fired 2 employees who'd been loyal to my mother, claiming they were no longer needed. When I confronted him about it, he laughed. "You think you can just walk in here and start giving orders? I built this company. I'm the one with the construction experience. You're just some college kid who's never held a real job." "I'm a partner," I said quietly. "You're a liability, and if you keep pushing this partnership nonsense, I'll dissolve the company and start over somewhere else." That threat was his final mistake. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 7 a.m. before Frank got there. I met with Dale and the senior foreman, explaining the situation and showing them the legal documents that proved my partnership. "Look," I told them, "Frank has been undermining this partnership and putting the company at risk. As a 50% owner, I have the right to protect my investment." "What does that mean?" Dale asked. "It means I'm exercising my rights as a partner to take control of day-to-day operations until we can resolve this dispute." When Frank arrived at 8 a.m., he found me sitting in his office behind his desk with Patricia and a security guard. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "This is a partnership meeting," I replied calmly. "Please have a seat." Patricia handed him a formal notice. "Mr. Garrison, your partner has voted to remove you from operational control of Garrison Builders, effective immediately. You'll retain your 50% ownership, but you're no longer authorized to make unilateral decisions or represent the company in business matters." Frank read the notice, his face turning red. "You can't do this. This is my company." "It's our company," I corrected, "and you've been operating in violation of the partnership agreement. Until you're willing to acknowledge the partnership and work within its terms, You're suspended from management duties. I'll sue you. You can try, but Patricia has already filed a complaint with the State Business Licensing Board about your failure to properly register the partnership. If you want to fight this in court, we'll be happy to present evidence of your financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. Frank looked around the office, his office that he'd occupied for over a decade, and saw Dale and the foreman standing behind me. You're all making a mistake, he said finally. This kid doesn't know anything about construction. You're right, I said. I don't know anything about construction, but I know about business, and I know about treating people fairly, and I know about honoring the contributions of people who built something together. Frank gathered his personal items and left without another word. The security guard escorted him to his truck. As I watched him drive away, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to go. I'd hoped Frank would acknowledge my mother's partnership and work with me to continue building the company she'd helped create. But Frank's pride and selfishness had made that impossible. Over the next 6 months, I learned everything I could about the construction business. I worked with Dale to manage projects, studied contracts and regulations, and slowly earned the respect of the employees who'd initially been skeptical of my authority. More importantly, I started implementing the changes my mother had always advocated for. Better financial controls, more conservative bidding practices, improved employee benefits, and a focus on quality over quantity. The results were immediate. Within a year, Garrison Builders was more profitable than it had ever been. We'd expanded our client base, improved our safety record, and built a reputation for reliability and excellence. Frank made several attempts to regain control, including a lawsuit challenging the partnership agreement. But Patricia's documentation was thorough, and the evidence of his financial mismanagement was overwhelming. The court not only upheld the partnership, but also ordered Frank to pay additional damages for his breach of fiduciary duty. Eventually, Frank approached me about selling his share of the company. He was struggling financially, having failed to establish a new business, and needed the money. I'll give you fair market value, I told him, but I want you to know something first. What's that? My mother loved you. She loved you enough to give you credit for building something she helped create. She loved you enough to stay in the background so you could feel like the success was yours alone. She loved you enough to never demand recognition for her contributions. Frank looked uncomfortable. Eleanor was a good woman. She was, and she deserved better than to be erased from the history of what she built. I bought Frank's share of the company for $1.2 million, exactly what it was worth, according to an independent appraisal. He used the money to move to Florida, where he got a job as a project manager for a large construction firm. I kept the company name, Garrison Builders, but added a subtitle, Founded by Eleanor Martinez. It was a small acknowledgement, but it felt important. Today, the company employs over 50 people and generates more than $10 million in annual revenue. We specialize in sustainable construction practices and have won several awards for innovative building techniques. More importantly, we treat every employee like family. We provide excellent benefits, profit-sharing bonuses, and the kind of job security that's rare in the construction industry. I never moved back into the house where I'd grown up. Instead, I bought a smaller place closer to the office, and I turned my childhood home into a training center for young people interested in construction careers. It's called the Elena Martinez Center for Building Excellence. Frank and I haven't spoken since the day he sold his share of the company. I heard he's doing well in Florida, working on high-rise projects and keeping a low profile. I don't harbor any resentment toward him. He made his choices, and he had to live with the consequences. The man who'd once thrown me out of my own home and claimed my mother's work as his own had learned an expensive lesson about honesty and partnership. But the real lesson isn't about Frank. It's about my mother, who spent 14 years building something extraordinary while letting someone else take the credit. She taught me that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who work behind the scenes, who care more about results than recognition. And sometimes, justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the truth finally comes to light. 6 months ago, I received a letter from Frank. It was brief but heartfelt. "Chris, I know I was wrong about a lot of things. Your mother was an amazing woman, and she deserved better than I gave her. I'm sorry for what I put you through, and I'm glad to see what you've done with the company. She would be proud. Frank." I kept the letter, not because I needed his apology, but because it proved that even the most stubborn people can eventually learn to see the truth. My mother had been right about a lot of things. She'd been right about the business, right about treating people fairly, and right about the importance of building something that lasts. Most importantly, she'd been right about keeping those documents in the safe deposit box. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply proving that you belonged there all along.